He was a man of the water, a child of salt air and sunburned mornings. The kind of man who measured time not by calendars, but by tides. Caleb Ryan Moore had been born and raised in the Florida Keys, where turquoise water wrapped around the islands like a promise. Friends said he belonged to the sea more than the land. If there was a boat to fix, a line to cast, or a dive to plan, Caleb was there, quiet, steady, dependable. At just 29 years old, he had already built a reputation across the lower Keys as someone you could trust with your life. But in the early hours of June 17, 2023, that life ended violently. One gunshot, one 9mm bullet fired into his back. As Caleb lay bleeding on the living room floor of his stilted home on Big Coppic Key, he summoned what little strength he had left. His voice was weak, his breathing ragged, but his words were clear. Those words, spoken in the final moments of his life, will become the most devastating evidence in a case that shocked the Florida Keys and sent his girlfriend to prison. Caleb Ryan Moore was born on March 5, 1993, a true Keys native. He was raised by his mother, Laura Bennett, and his stepfather, Mark Bennett, alongside his younger brother, Evan. His biological father, Daniel Moore, had died years earlier, leaving Caleb to grow up surrounded by friends who became family. And family mattered to him. The fishing docks, the dive shops, the tight-knit marine community. That was his world. Friends like Ryan Keller and Nick Paloma later told reporters the same thing again and again. Caleb was one of the best people they had ever known. Hard-working, loyal, soft-spoken, always smiling. He loved sunsets, long days on the water, and coming home to his dog, Anchor, after a long shift. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He didn't make enemies, which made what happened next almost impossible to understand. When Caleb met Madison Claire Holloway, it felt like fate. Madison was 33, recently relocated from Stuart, Florida. She had attended Florida Keys Community College and worked in the marine industry. By the time she met Caleb, she owned a paddleboard rental and tour company operating out of a Key West hotel. She loved the ocean. She loved diving. She loved fishing. On the surface, they were perfect. Mutual friends in the marine world introduced them, and the connection was immediate. Within months, Madison had moved in with Caleb at 491 Harbor Avenue, a stilted home on Big Coppic Key. They shared with a roommate, 46-year-old Trevor Lane. To outsiders, they looked happy. They worked similar jobs. They spent weekends on the water. They laughed easily. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. In hindsight, the red flags were everywhere. Hannah Cole, who was dating one of Caleb's childhood friends, later told investigators that Madison seemed normal most of the time, friendly, charismatic. But when alcohol entered the picture, everything changed. Hannah described it as a switch flipping. Madison would scream, throw objects, hit Caleb. Yet Caleb never reported the abuse, never called police, never filed a complaint. Friends would later realize he was protecting her, or maybe he was protecting the illusion. One incident stood out above the rest. At a birthday party organized to help Caleb reconnect with an old friend, Logan Reeves, who happened to be Madison's ex-boyfriend, things spiraled out of control. The plan was simple: clear the air and move forward. Madison had other ideas. Witnesses said she became enraged when Caleb didn't react negatively to seeing Logan at the American Rock Bar. People watched in disbelief as she scratched and slapped Caleb in public. Later that night, blood stained his shirt, and others, they joked nervously, called her the witch. No one was laughing the next morning. She wrecked the house, one friend later told investigators. Glass everywhere. She beat him pretty bad. That was the night many realized this wasn't just a bad relationship. It was dangerous. Another incident unfolded at a wedding. On the drive home, a friend casually mentioned something about Madison's father's hunting property. When Caleb asked her about it, she punched him, a full left hook, no hesitation. "Don't ever talk about my dad," she snapped. 2 days before Caleb's death, Madison's violent fantasies became even more disturbing. On June 15th, 2023, she was drinking at the Hogfish Bar with Samantha Ruiz, the girlfriend of one of Caleb's closest friends. Madison began ranting about her ex-boyfriend Logan. Then she made a stabbing motion. Again and again, she described plunging a blade upward, right to his neck. She said, "I'd kill him." Samantha was horrified. Madison hadn't dated Logan in over a year. The casual way she described killing someone, complete with gestures, was so unsettling that Samantha called Caleb to pick them up early. That night, Caleb drove her home. 2 days later, he was dead. Friday evening, June 16th, 2023, began like so many others. Caleb, Madison, and their roommate Trevor returned from work and gathered on the patio beneath their stilted home. They drank as the sun dipped below the horizon. Trial testimony later revealed something else was used that night too. Illegal drugs. A volatile mix. Eventually, everyone went to bed, but peace didn't last. At approximately 2:45 a.m., Trevor Lane was jolted awake by shouting. He could hear raised voices coming from the living room. Caleb and Madison, arguing. Then Madison screamed. Trevor ran out of his bedroom. What he found would haunt him forever. Caleb was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing shallow. When Trevor asked what happened, Caleb looked at him and spoke, "That bitch shot me in the back." Madison was cradling him. She didn't react. No denial, no shock, no protest. Trevor called 911. "She's bleeding him bad," he told the dispatcher. "There's so much blood." When asked where Caleb was wounded, Madison answered calmly, "He's bleeding from his back." Deputies arrived within minutes. Madison was still holding Caleb. He was pronounced dead at the hospital at 3:46 a.m. The living room told a story. A 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun lay near a dog kennel. One spent shell casing. One shot fired. The gun belonged to Madison. The autopsy revealed the truth. Caleb had been shot in the lower left back. From behind, he wasn't facing his attacker. Even more disturbing, his body showed signs of repeated physical abuse. Injuries to his head and neck, bruising, scratches, a violent struggle, not self-defense. And Madison? No marks on her neck, no bruises, no scratches, no burst capillaries in her eyes, but bruises covered her knuckles, evidence she had struck someone. Madison's explanation didn't come all at once. At first, she claimed memory loss. Then, she claimed Caleb strangled her. Then, she claimed PTSD from childhood abuse. Then, she denied firing the gun. Detectives noticed something else. Madison normally kept her gun in her purse, stored in her unlocked car beneath the house. After the shooting, the purse was open. The gun was gone, which meant one thing. She retrieved it deliberately and fired while Caleb's back was turned. On June 17th, 2023, Madison Claire Holloway was arrested for murder. Her bond was set at $750,000. Her stand your ground motion failed. At trial in February 2025, prosecutors built their case around 3 facts. Caleb's dying words, Madison's gun, the physical evidence. The jury deliberated less than 45 minutes. Guilty of second-degree murder with a firearm. On April 11, 2025, Madison was sentenced to 40 years in Florida State Prison. She won't be eligible for release until at least 2048. During the trial, one detail barely made headlines. A detail buried deep in testimony. Something that didn't quite fit. Something investigators quietly noted but never fully explained. Because there may have been another voice in that house that night. Another sound, another movement, and a phone call that was never played in court. The jury never heard it. Not in full. Not the way it actually happened. Because while the courtroom focused on the gun, the bruises, and Caleb's dying words, investigators were quietly wrestling with something far more unsettling. There were gaps in the timeline. And inside those gaps lived a question no one wanted to ask out loud. At 2:48 a.m., just minutes after the gunshot, a call hit Monroe County Dispatch. Not from Madison, not from Trevor, but from Caleb's phone. The call lasted only seconds. Too short to trace properly. Too chaotic to make sense of. All dispatch log was this. Open line. Background noise. A male voice struggling to speak. Then disconnect. By the time Trevor made the official 911 call moments later, that first call had already been buried under protocol. It was marked as accidental, non-actionable, but one detective didn't buy it because Caleb had been shot in the back. And according to medical testimony, he should not have been able to move easily, let alone reach his phone, after the bullet tore through him. So who made that call? From the moment the gunshot rang out to the moment Trevor entered the living room, nearly 4 minutes passed. For minutes where no one could say, under oath, what Madison was doing. She claimed she was in shock. She claimed she was panicking. She claimed she was trying to help him. But forensic evidence suggested something else. Blood spatter patterns showed Caleb had been moved, not dragged, not far, but repositioned, which meant someone had time, and clarity, and control. 3 houses down, Margaret Lewis, a retired schoolteacher, told deputies she was awakened by shouting that night, not just arguing, but a second male voice, deeper, angrier, short bursts of sound like commands, then silence. Margaret assumed it was drunken yelling and went back to sleep. By morning, the street was swarming with police. She gave a statement. It was filed and never mentioned again. Trevor Lane was cooperative, calm, consistent, but detectives noticed something strange. His phone showed deleted messages, recent calls wiped clean, and a single outgoing call placed at 2:41 a.m. for minutes before the gunshot to a number registered under a prepaid plan, untraceable. When asked, Trevor said he couldn't remember making the call, said he was half asleep, said it must have been accidental. But phone records don't dial themselves. Ballistics confirmed the bullet came from Madison's gun. That much was true, but trajectory analysis raised eyebrows. The angle suggested Caleb was slightly turned, not fully facing away, as if reacting, as if someone else had drawn his attention first. Someone standing where Madison said she wasn't. At 3:02 a.m., while paramedics were still working on Caleb, Madison's phone received a text from an unknown contact, handled, she never responded. The message was later dismissed as unrelated. No follow-up, no subpoena, Just another loose thread. Prosecutors had a strong case. Too strong to risk complicating. Caleb's dying declaration alone could convict. The gun was hers. The history of violence was undeniable. Introducing alternative theories would only muddy the waters. And so, part 2 of the story, the part with unanswered calls, unaccounted minutes, and unheard voices, was quietly set aside. Madison Holloway was guilty. That much was clear. But whether she acted entirely alone, that remains an open question. One detective later said, "Off the record, we convicted the right person. I'm just not convinced we convicted everyone, because somewhere between the shouting, the silence, and that first forgotten phone call, there's a truth still sitting in the dark, and it may never come to light." The verdict brought closure to the public. It did not bring closure to the case, because once the cameras left the courthouse and Madison Holloway was transported to Lowell Correctional Institution, the evidence didn't just go into storage. Some of it moved, and one piece never came back. After a homicide conviction, evidence is sealed and cataloged. Firearms are logged. Phones are preserved. Digital records are archived. Nothing leaves without a paper trail. That's the rule. But in the months following Madison's sentencing, an internal audit inside the Monroe County Sheriff's Office flagged something unusual in the Moore case file. An item marked "Transferred Temporary Review." No return date. No receiving signature. No destination listed. Just a blank line where accountability should have been. It wasn't the gun. It wasn't the bullet. It wasn't blood evidence. It was Caleb's phone. The same phone that made the unexplained call at 2:48 a.m. The same phone investigators claimed held no additional evidentiary value. According to records, the device was removed from evidence 6 weeks after the verdict. Official reason: further digital clarification. But clarification by whom? The department couldn't say, because the request didn't come from prosecutors. It didn't come from defense. And it didn't come from a judge. A former evidence technician, speaking anonymously, later said the phone was released under a verbal authorization. No court order, no case number attached, just a name that didn't appear anywhere else in file. When the technician asked for written confirmation, they were told it's being handled at a higher level. The phone left the building and never returned. Modern phones don't forget. Even deleted calls could be recovered. Metadata can show movement. Background audio can be enhanced. If Caleb's phone had been fully analyzed, it could have answered who placed the first call, whether another voice was present, if the phone was moved after the shooting, whether someone else touched it. But without the device, those answers vanished permanently. Caleb's mother, Laura Bennett, was never notified. Neither was his brother. They assumed all evidence was preserved. They assumed the system worked. When a journalist later asked the sheriff's office about the phone, the response was brief. All relevant evidence was reviewed prior to conviction. No explanation, no follow-up, no acknowledgement of the missing item. This wasn't about freeing Madison Holloway. She is where she belongs. This was about truth, about whether someone else played a role, about whether warnings were ignored, about whether justice stopped short of its full reach. Because when evidence disappears after a verdict, it raises a different question. What were they afraid it might reveal? Officially, the case of Caleb Ryan Moore is closed. But unofficially, it's a story still breathing beneath the surface, in dockside bars, in quiet living rooms, in the minds of the people who heard something that night and were never asked again one life ended, one woman convicted, and one truth locked away with a phone that vanished into silence. Caleb once told a friend, "The ocean always tells the truth. You just have to listen long enough." The water around the Keys still moves the same way it did that night, but some truths, they were never allowed to surface. This has been A Terrible Girlfriend.